So I think it's interesting, having David as the final speaker. We had planned on him as the beginning, and he had to use a little bit of his agility to travel and get through the airports to get here. But David's really kind of a person that's moved from methodology to methodology to methodology, hopefully with good purpose, trying new things each time to find different ways to do things. So you may see him as an Agile guy, or a feature-driven development guy, or a lean person, or a Kanban person. So it's interesting to see the evolution that David took in his career, and kind of goes back to what Andy Hunt was talking about this morning, that they expected to have lots of methodologies and people trying lots of new things. Well, David's a person that's done that. So we wanted to bring someone in that's kind of pushing to say, well, you're trying to create agility. What's the next thing? What's some other things that people are trying, so that you can pick and choose the things that are going to work best for you. So that's really my introduction. So let's let David close off the conference here.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Andy Hunt again for swapping with me today. American cancelled a flight last night, and I ended up staying in Chicago. So the earliest I could get here was about lunchtime. So thanks to the organizers for your quick response, and thanks to Andy for being so flexible. When I was first asked to come to this conference, nowadays I'm pretty busy and I tend to say no to regional events. But what attracted me to this was the title, Path to Agility. If it had been Path to Agile, I wouldn't be here. And I think you've heard a number of times today that you shouldn't do Agile. Agility is an attribute that you should be able to observe in your business and perhaps in your personal life, your personal capabilities and performance. But you should be able to measure agility in your business. And just because you're doing Agile doesn't necessarily mean that you're exhibiting agility in that business. So I retitled this talk, Kanban, an alternative path to agility, because I'm sure there are plenty of you in the audience that believe the path to agility is to adopt an agile software development method. And while this may be true, as early as a decade ago, in fact, a little more than a decade ago, about 11, 12 years ago, I recognized in my work as a manager, first at Sprint PCS and then later at Motorola, that trying to scale out adoption of an agile method across a large organization was problematic. People resisted. Departments would look at other departments who'd already adopted it and say, that's all very well for them, it will never work here. Our situation's completely different. So while I was writing my first book, the Agile Management book, in 2002, I recognized I was writing the wrong book. It was a book that at the time I believed was full of tremendously good and sound advice, and now I believe it's full of about 2/3 tremendously good and sound advice and 1/3 complete bullshit. This was a lesson learned in don't put stuff in the book unless you've tried it first. And I would encourage you to challenge anyone who's published an Agile book, whether the stuff in their book is stuff they've actually observed happening in real businesses, or whether it's stuff they thought would be really good. Because it turns out usually when I do that, when I publish thought experiments, it catches me out. So that was an important lesson learned. But while I was writing that book, I thought, okay, this book's full of really good advice. And then I realized while I was writing it that it was largely unimplementable, because there was no advice on the book on how to actually make this scale in large organizations and institutionalize within those organizations. And I started thinking about that problem. And through several iterations of other things, eventually Kanban emerged. So first of all, a little bit on the meaning of Agile. Now, I've been following the Twitter stream today, and I know some other people have talked about this, and hopefully what I'm going to say aligns with those other smart people. Right, so what Agile methods were seeking to achieve, I'm not going to bore you with a slide with a nice picture of the Agile manifesto. It's always a good way to fill up an Agile talk. Slide on the manifesto, talk through it carefully, slide on the principles, talk through them carefully, 15 minutes is gone. The first thing here is, Agile methods primarily ask us to make progress with imperfect information. Right? The old way, the old software development life cycle that was primarily driven by research by Barry Boehm from the 1970s and his book Software Engineering Economics in 1981 was the notion that the cost of change rose exponentially as you went further through the life cycle and as time progressed. And therefore, you should spend lots of time and energy up front trying to get really perfect requirements. And then try to produce really perfect analysis and really perfect designs and really perfect code. Because trying to make changes later was astronomically expensive. This meant that we invested a lot as an industry in analysis, requirements development methods. In fact, lots of stuff that didn't involve actually producing working code. And the Agile movement was really a rebellion against that. And in Kent Beck's first edition of Extreme Programming, he speculated that there was a different cost of change curve that went like this. Now, actually, the BAME people and the academics, they have the evidence to support this cost of change curve. On the other hand, I think Kent mostly sketched his. But the argument is real, that maybe it makes sense to just get started. And as more information arrives, make course corrections. And we developed a word for that in terms of the code, and that was refactoring. The next thing is, Agile methods should enable a high-trust culture. In fact, they largely assume that there's a high-trust culture. What do we mean by that? A culture that's free of bureaucracy, where there's a lot of collaborative working, and people are generally empowered to make their own decisions. One of the impediments to Agile adoption is you probably don't work in a company that has a culture like that. And it would be good if you could develop that culture, but if it's a prerequisite for making Agile methods work, then there's an impedance there, and that is going to cause a problem with adoption. The next thing is, Agile methods really ask us to treat work in progress as if it's a liability rather than an asset, to focus on reducing the lead times for delivery. The primary reason is that knowledge work is perishable, and there are all sorts of reasons for this. Chemical computer inside, no digital storage, right? No exact recall. Another thing is that human beings work socially with other human beings, and we store knowledge in our social group. So if you have a family, if you have a spouse, if you have children, if you have parents, at least if you're close enough to them still, you store information in these other people. This is one of the reasons that when a couple who've been married a long time, if one of them dies, the other one feels a lot of pain for a prolonged period of time because they lost a lot of information that they had stored in the other person. Basic things like, where do we keep the chemicals for cleaning the toilet? The next thing is, Agile asked us to put feedback loops in our organization. I think Andy Hunt talked about this morning also. And enable a capability to adapt. Maybe the first Agile book published was Jim Highsmith's Adaptive Software Development in 1998. And what he was talking about there were the emergence of methods that helped software developers adapt to changing requirements during the lifetime of a project. And largely, that generation of Agile methods are about adapting to changing requirements because the business environment is moving, the requirements change. That we shouldn't be doing these great big batch size projects that get referred to as the waterfall method. Although, if you've been paying attention, you'll know that the Agile Alliance's historian, who's been researching this, can't actually find any reference to anything called waterfall anywhere. It's some sort of myth that built up. It's the Agile demon. The Agile movement needed something to hate. It needed an enemy, and somehow this waterfall demon emerged. But actually, what we mean by waterfall are very large batch transfer projects, generally in some phase gate governance process, where the batch transfer between the phase gates was 100% of the scope of the project. And if you believed in the Boehm change curve and his software engineering economics, then you would spend lots of time in those early phases trying to be perfect. Everything would take far too long. And that was fine in the 1970s when projects were small. But by the late 1990s, when projects were massive, it didn't make sense anymore. The last thing on this list is the Agile movement really promoted the idea of craftsmanship and a work ethic that said we should build really high quality, well-engineered code. We shouldn't necessarily go and build all sorts of frameworks and things we might not need, but the code should be, to use a more modern term, well-factored, and that would make it easy to change in the future when new information arrived. So that the craftsmanship practice supports the idea that we should make progress with imperfect information. All right, so if those were the ideas that help us improve our agility, how might we get there if people are resisting the adoption of an agile software development method? So Kanban, an alternative path to agility. I'm going to start with a definition of the method, and then I'll talk more about how we got there. First of all, it's not a process-centric approach at all. It's a management and cultural approach. It's about managing your organizations better in order to improve your agility, and about changing the culture in order to enable that better management. And for best fit, you need to view your organization, this creative knowledge work generating organization, as a set of services. And you build a Kanban system for each one of those services. And it encourages a management focus on demand for those services. It's what are you serving and what's the demand for it. If you manage the Starbucks for a living, you serve cups of coffee. And if I walked into the Starbucks and I found the shift supervisor or the store manager and asked, what's the demand been like today, they can answer that question. Right? They understand how many people have come in demanding cups of coffee and how many they've served. I often find managers in the IT world struggle to answer this question. What is it you do? What does your department do? What do you serve? They really struggle to answer that, which means that they really struggle to manage their business because they don't know what business they're in. Most IT managers believe they're dating agents, that what comes in are some sort of set of tasks, and those tasks require certain skills, and they have a workforce with certain skills. So they try to match up a suitable task with a suitable worker and send them on a date together for 2 or 3 days. Starbucks managers are not dating agents. Right? They know what business they're in. They serve cups of coffee. Right? So the Kanban method is not a software development lifecycle process, nor is it a project management process. It's something to help you manage your business better. Right? So the message here is don't do this. And this is what is fundamentally different about Kanban and why it is in some ways very revolutionary and a discontinuous innovation in the way we've thought about things, and why it's really very different from Agile methods that came before. Because this diagram is supposed to show the idea that managers believe that process is something that workers do. And installing a new process is something that you do to the workers. And in order to make it easy, perhaps you hire some consultants or coaches or some internal organization whose job it is to install new processes amongst your workers and get them to behave differently. One of the things that Barry Bame's research really did get right in his Software Engineering Economics, published in 1981, just to remind you, that's a whole 32 years ago now, was that the biggest leverage point in improving the performance of software development is improving the management. So what's wrong with this diagram? Right? The managers believe they don't need to change. This is the fundamental problem. So, the Kanban method uses visualization of otherwise invisible knowledge work because you know what? The Starbucks guy, he has it easy. He can see the cups of coffee. He can see the cups, he can see the espresso machine, he can see the customers walking in the door. But most of what we do is invisible. You can't see it. And what we're doing with Kanban is putting a mechanism in place in an organization that's the equivalent of organizational DNA, a way of helping your organization evolve organizationally and process-wise. It is a process to change your processes. And if that sounds very meta, I think it's important. Right? If you try to create a process that's designed to change itself, it will create its own internal resistance. It's better to have a separate mechanism in your organization to provoke the changes. Oops. So, what you do here is you Kanbanize your existing processes. You need to be doing something already. So if someone comes to me and said, oh, I'm forming a new organization, it's a greenfield site, we're recruiting all the new people, can you help us with the Kanban process? The answer is no. You need to figure out how to build software first, and then we'll help you. Right, so provoke existing processes to change and the service delivery to improve. That's what we're trying to do. That you could have two different approaches to improvement. You could say, whatever you're doing now sucks. Stop what you're doing, adopt to this completely different way of working. And that sounds easy. How many of you have found that that approach is actually quite challenging? Right? A lot of laughter in the audience. On the other hand, if what you do now sucks and you change it a little and it gets a little better, it's still a little bit better. Right? And if you change it again and it gets a little bit better, it's a little bit better. And don't ever forget that that's a little bit better. Right? It's like signing up to go to the gym and actually showing up and doing some working out. And you may not become an Olympic athlete, but you'll be a little bit better. Right? And you'll feel better about yourself in all sorts of ways. Maybe you'll do a little more and you'll get a little bit better. So don't underestimate the value of getting a little bit better. There are many bosses in your company would love if you could do that, especially if it came at very low risk with very little resistance from the workforce. So the result is that workflows, processes in your organization will evolve and they will get fitter for their circumstances. I know that people are doing Kanban wrongly if I visit them and discover that they've got a standard Kanban process. This would be wrong. Every workflow in your organization should have its own uniquely tailored process because they're dealing with their own set of risks, their own set of demand, their own set of capabilities to supply against that demand. There is no reason in knowledge work that I can imagine for standardizing processes anywhere. That is a recipe for disaster for your business. And if you're sitting in this audience and your job is to standardize the processes in your organization, then I'm sorry. but I'd prefer that your organization didn't have your department. Right. Customer and employee satisfaction improves when people get to work in their own uniquely tailored process designed for their specific circumstances, particularly when they decided how it should be and it wasn't imposed from the outside. Okay, so in 2009, I had to work out exactly what was it that organizations doing this Kanban thing that I had taught them, what is it they're doing that's making it work? And I came up with a list of 5 and then realized I'd missed one out. So, you know, it's always worth waiting for the second edition of any book. Right, so this list here, and I call this the generalized version now, because it turned out this generalized version was in some way some sort of stroke of genius, if only I'd thought of that at the time, because it's so general that it enabled all sorts of innovation. So many of you might have heard of something called personal Kanban. And if I'd made this list too specific, personal Kanban wouldn't have emerged. We've also seen people adapt it for things like portfolio management. So there's portfolio Kanban. And those things wouldn't have emerged. We've also discovered that trying to do Kanban at the beginning can still be a little challenging for reasons I'll come to in a moment. And instead of the second one on this list should say implement a virtual Kanban system. Instead, I said limit your work in progress. It turned out that was so specifically vague that it helped people make progress without actually doing a Kanban system. And maybe 9 months or a year later, they've developed the organizational maturity to go to the next level. We now call that interim step proto-Kanban. And that wouldn't have emerged if this list hadn't been so general. So while I was actually not terribly smart about this, it turned out to be very fortunate that the list is general. So first of all, we need to visualize, make the invisible work visible so that we can manage it. Secondly, limit the work in progress. Third, manage the flow of that work from the source of the demand to wherever it gets delivered. Those first 3 were fairly obvious to most people, and most stuff you read about Kanban will mention these 3. But when I first saw that someone else published this in 2008, I thought, okay, it's a good list, but it's not sufficient. The 4th one's very important. Make process policies explicit. It turns out in most organizations there are many things going on which are implied, or are to some extent breaking the rules, but no one ever talks about it. It's undiscussable. When you start to write the policies down, people can challenge them. So if there's an implicit policy in your organization that if the CEO sends out an email memo, it gets done immediately as an express item, writing that down and showing it to all the management team will actually stop that behavior, because the CEO doesn't know he's doing it. And I know it happens, it even happens in my company. Right? I send out emails and people say, how am I supposed to deal with this with all the other stuff that I'm already doing? And I say, well, I didn't ask you to start it. But it's just implied that because the chief executive sent the email, we should start it. Writing that stuff down actually helps manage it. Then we've got implement feedback loops. And the last one on this list is also not intuitive. There's work by a guy who was a keynote speaker at my conference last year, Yochai Benkler. And he studies evolution in social memes. And in his keynote last year at our conference in Boston, he talked a lot about what's required to facilitate learning. It is not simply random experimentation. Do one thing, try something else, see if it worked better. Random experimentation leads to neuropsychologically just pattern matching. It leads to the development of superstition and superstitious behavior. On the other hand, if you have some model for understanding the world you're in and predicting the outcome of an experiment, when it works or it doesn't work, you can question that and you can learn from it. So we're really trying to move the needle in knowledge work management here to make it a lot more scientific, and to make changes that are implemented in an organization to be very intentional and then to be measured using the feedback loop. All right, enough of the theory. First of all, what's a Kanban system? Kanban systems are Japanese things. This is a picture of one in action. In the top left, the plastic card in the person's hand that says admission ticket, that is a Kanban. And what you see here are the Imperial Palace Gardens, the East Gardens of the Imperial Palace in downtown Tokyo. Has anyone visited there? A few people. So the ones who've been there will know that the Imperial Palace Gardens are housed inside the medieval walled city of Edo. And in relatively modern times, the late 19th century, the old city was demolished and turned into a park. The bottom line is there's only two ways into this park. There's the old east gate to the city and there's the north gate to the city. And to get in, you have to cross over a bridge over a moat. And as you do that, you will be presented with your admission ticket, plastic card about the thickness of a poker chip. You don't pay for it. And then perhaps you walk around the park, you have a picnic with your family, and you decide you're going to leave later on. You can leave by the east or the north gate, doesn't matter. And when you're leaving, you have to line up at this kiosk here and return your admission ticket. It's not an admission ticket. Right? You didn't pay for it. This is a Kanban, and the circulation of these Kanban, also plural, this makes it a little difficult. It's one of these words, when you use it in English, it's like sheep. You know, a sheep, many sheep, a Kanban, many Kanban. Hence the reason I do this sort of after dinner talk called Why Kanban is Like Sheep. So the circulation of these tickets is a Kanban system. And what they're doing with these Kanban is limiting the number of people inside the park. Why would they want to do that? Comfort? Yeah, that's one reason. I think the main reason is it's really actually very pretty, and they'd like it to stay that way. And if on, say, the Emperor's birthday, the 23rd of December, 11 million Tokyoites decided they'd all like to descend on the park for an afternoon out, that would be pretty uncomfortable. So yes, comfort and the preservation of the park. This is a Kanban system in action. The idea with Kanban was adopted or adapted into manufacturing industry in 1947 by Toyota, Taiichi Ohno. And they specifically used it to limit the inventory inside factories, which is actually very useful if you're a manufacturing company. It allows you to control your working capital much better. It allows you to control the time it takes for components to come in one end and finished goods to go out the other, and to be very predictable. It's counterintuitive that this would be useful for us. And what we're doing is rightfully called a virtual Kanban system. And all my early presentations in 2006 and 2007 used this term. But we're geeks. We take virtual for granted. Right? The word virtual very quickly disappeared. And that left us with Kanban system for software engineering. And that doesn't play too well at the cocktail party after the conference. Try it in the next hour. Walk up to someone with a beer and say, hey, are you doing virtual Kanban systems in your software engineering? Much easier to walk up and say, hey, are you doing Kanban? Right? Because it's the one word that made it stick. So, how many of you have heard from some other perhaps well-known, well-respected Agile people in North America that Kanban is about boards with sticky notes on them? No one willing to admit it. These people are misguided, and they have been misguided for many years, and I travel all over the world, and I have to tell you that the largest amount of misguidance on Kanban is here in North America. Most of the Agile community here really do not talk accurately about Kanban at all, and they do not understand this concept. So when I show you a board like this, the virtual Kanban are the numbers at the top of the columns. Right? This board is visualizing a process, and this process was a workflow for a team at Microsoft in 2004. These are the virtual Kanban. Right? The Kanban are not the sticky notes on the board. That is a North American Agile myth. And if you've had any Kanban advice, guidance, or training from anyone who taught you that, you wasted your money. Skip past this. The next thing here is, in Kanban, the core concept is commitment is deferred, right? At the point where we pull something in to the Kanban system, our virtual Kanban system, we are essentially saying to our customer that we're going to do it for you. And the flip side of that is that the customer is saying, we're absolutely sure we really, really want it. In the Kanban community, this is now referred to as the Spice Girls question. Because you say to the customer, tell me what you want, what you really, really want. And once you've decided you really, really want it, you better not change your mind, right? We wish to avoid discarding it after the commitment point. So that's basically with these pop-ups. Meanwhile, things before the commitment point are essentially optional. This can be disturbing for your customers because they're used to calling up, maybe coming to a meeting, going back to their colleagues and saying, it's okay, I talked with the IT guys and they're working on it. Warm and comfortable, fuzzy feeling. IT's working on it. Absolutely no guarantee when you're going to finish it. And whatever you've promised them is wrong. Right? So this core concept of deferred commitment, this is the hard bit. This is why if practice number 2 had said implement a virtual Kanban system, it would actually be very hard to do Kanban. And the proto-Kanban mechanism wouldn't have emerged. I apologize, I'm going to talk about 1 or 2 things that are not in the slide deck because there's only so much I can do in an hour. The next thing here is studying real data, real organizations. What we've discovered is discard rates are often very high. So this is stuff the customer thought they wanted, and then you didn't do it. Maybe it lingers for years and years, but it's effectively dead. What do you think a typical discard rate is in most organizations? Does anybody know the discard rate in their own organization? Anyone in the audience? A big audience here. Very low. I find that hard to believe. You must work in a very boring business. So we've actually had quite a lot of companies report this, and the number that comes up again and again is about 50%. So why is this? Why do we have so many ideas and we only implement about half of them? Well, the main reason is the future is uncertain. If we were absolutely certain about the future, we would know exactly what we want and we would implement all of it. How many of you work in a business where you're absolutely certain about the future? Right? A discard rate of 0 implies that there is no uncertainty in the future. So if you work in a business with a very low discard rate, you're either carrying a lot of risk that you don't realize you're carrying, or you're in a very boring business where things don't change very much. We need more ideas than we can implement, and those ideas have value even though we discard them because the future is uncertain. It's a core concept in real option theory. Also, deferring commitment and avoiding interrupting workers to do things like estimating future speculative work makes sense when the discard rates are high. If you throw away half of the ideas you've got, why would you interrupt your workers who are doing the committed work in order to have them do speculative work? This is probably the most commonly recurring problem that we find as we go around the world, and one of the core reasons that Kanban systems make sense, because they highlight this problem, which causes a discussion about what to do about it. The next idea is, how often would we replenish this input queue for our Kanban system, the replenishment frequency, or cadence, sometimes referred to? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on your business. There is no point in holding a meeting with business stakeholders to replenish your input queue if no new information arrived since the last time you met with them, because they won't have any input to give you. So the information arrival rate and the rate of change in your domain will determine how often you do this, as well as the transaction and coordination cost of holding the meeting to make the decisions. So in some places, it makes sense to do this twice a day. There's an organization in Brazil that uses Kanban now for managing the video graphic post-processing on the production of afternoon soap operas, daytime soap operas at Globo TV in Rio de Janeiro. They replenish their input queue twice a day because they work on an 11-day lead time. Footage that was shot 11 days ago goes out this afternoon. Right? So they shoot the raw footage and then they add all the graphic embellishment to the video, and they get so many days to do that, and it has to be ready because people who watch the daytime soaps wouldn't like it if you skipped a day. So frequent replenishment is more agile. On-demand replenishment would be the most agile. If every time there was a slot free in that input queue, you replenished it immediately, that would be the most agile you could get as far as replenishment is concerned. I've only met one team that could do that, and they were the first ever team that did Kanban at Microsoft in 2004. So it's not entirely a holy grail, but it doesn't happen often. On the other end, what's the delivery frequency? Well, in the Agile world, we're very proud of ourselves for developing a capability to deliver often, perhaps continuously, but actually the customer might not want that. Usually the delivery frequency is controlled by the rate the customer can take delivery. And really, Agile businesses invest in making that easier. They put features in their product, or they invest in infrastructure in their environment to make it easier for customers to take delivery. A very agile business in Brazil, Fidelis, they make management software for universities. And they invested very heavily in the feature mix in their product to make the product easier to deploy and to make it easier for customers to adapt to new features. Some web sites are very good at this, but corporate IT departments not so much. If you work in a bank, you're probably more capable of deploying than the branches are of taking delivery. And therefore, if you make your delivery process better, you have not benefited your employer. Help the branches to get more agile to take delivery more often. Right, so frequent deployment is more agile. On-demand deployment is most agile. So that's two elements in the agility equation. This next thing says specific delivery commitment may be deferred until later. It turns out that when you commit, when the customer says, I really, really want it, and you say, we're really, really going to do it for you, you actually don't need to commit on when it will be delivered. Maybe approximately, but not exactly. It's a two-phase commit process. Right? That we could wait until that ticket moves across the board until we're much more certain when we can deliver it and on which particular delivery vehicle, which release we can push it out on. Then we can make that second commitment to actually deliver it. It's the two-phase commit of you get engaged and then you get married. The engagement is indeed the commitment, but there isn't a specific date until you've locked that in and communicated it. Only one person laughed at that. Okay, so the next thing we care about is how fast can you get something done? And this is really important Because deferred commitment, the idea that the customer will be prepared to not have you commit on something, actually gets a lot easier if you can go really quickly. Because once something's committed, it's finished quickly. And if the customer trusts that that happens, and happens reliably, they'll feel comfortable deferring commitment until later. If it takes a long time to get stuff done, and perhaps it's not very reliable, that you're not good at delivering on something when you think you will, then the customer will want you to commit much earlier. The result is much more work in progress, much more complexity in the system, much less predictability. Everything takes longer, so there's less business agility, there is more risk being carried, and so on. So we define the lead time for the Kanban system starting here when we commit on something until it hits the first infinite queue, because an infinite queue is the end of the Kanban system. What's going on in this process is a user acceptance testing batch transfer and then a release batch transfer. So we've got a Kanban flow system and then 2 batch transfers before we get to the customer. And it's important to know this because we need to know the frequency of the batch transfers as well as the lead time through the Kanban system if we're going to make some prediction of the end-to-end lead time for the customer. If we define the lead time the way I've just shown you, this equation, Little's law from queuing theory, works. Right, what this says, what I've got here is the algebra and the geometry, and this is a real chart from a real project. And the height of work in progress divided by the average lead time is equal to the average delivery rate. And then graphically what we see there is that the height between started and finished on any given day is the quantity of work in progress. And the horizontal distance from started to finished represents the average lead time for items that were started on this day. And therefore the slope between those 2 points gives us the average delivery rate. So if you're trying to manage a big project with a large number of items in it, then understanding this equation and understanding that the Kanban system will give you predictability around the average lead time and predictability around the quantity of work in progress, and therefore a lot of confidence in your average delivery rate, this will enable you to manage the risk on the delivery of the large project over time and manage that probabilistically. This means that with a mechanism like this, as long as we have a reasonable idea of the height of the y-axis, we can make very accurate forecasts very quickly. No need to estimate the items. And it also doesn't matter what size they are. It's a probabilistic approach. Now, this is hard unless you've studied quantum physics at university. It's hard for anyone else to get their head around it. But probabilistic approach means you do not need to know what size the items are. This will be another myth that you've heard from Agile North Americans, that Kanban only works if you have very small items and they're all about the same size. No, this is wrong. Actually, Kanban will help you if it's the opposite situation, where you have lots of variety in the size of the objects. All right, this next thing is maybe the most important slide. And I know I'm running out of time here, but I will skip a few things after this. Flow efficiency is the idea that from when we start something to when we deliver it, we only spend a certain amount of that time actually working on it. Now, if you guys are textbook extreme programmers, your local flow efficiency is probably very high. But for your organization, from the point where there's a customer commitment to the point where there's a customer delivery, what do you think a typical flow efficiency number is? So flow efficiency is this equation here, right? The working time divided by the lead time times 100%. Anyone like to speculate? 10%? That's not a bad thing. First of all, I've divided these columns into waiting and working columns, but typically most organizations have so much work that actually they're not being worked on when they're in the working column. There's a lot of multitasking, so it's actually working, waiting, 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 working, waiting, working, waiting, 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 working. So we actually have to account for that. when we're monitoring this stuff. Anyway, here are some real numbers. A guy called Zolt Fabok reported these numbers from his organization at a conference two conferences last year, 2%. Another Kanban consultant in Sweden, Håkan Fors, has measured this with all his new clients over the last 18 months. Never greater than 5%. My personal experience is 5 to 15%, and the first ever team we did this with at Microsoft was 8%. What that means is, thinking back to our Little's Law equation, remember, WIP divided by the average lead time gives the average delivery rate. As much as 98% of that lead time is not working. Now, how many of you work in an organization where there's a vice president or a senior director of not working? And yet, improving your not working, your queuing, your delays, your blocking, that's where the biggest leverage is in improving your productivity. Imagine you're 5% flow efficient, and 2.5 of that 5, so half of the 5% is development. Imagine we fire all our developers and we get really, really good super extreme programming guys who are 10 times faster than the idiots that we just fired. How much more delivery do we actually get out of our organization? We improve software development by a factor of 10. We have a 5% flow efficient organization. How much more delivery do we get? You're such a cynic. 0% is the maximum about 2%. And it's probably a rounding error to some extent. Hence the reason that some senior executives at some big companies have called me in and said, I'm thinking of one specific example in the UK, where they'd spent something like £14 million sterling on extreme programming training. Good business for that particular supplier in the UK. More than 2,000 people trained in extreme programming. Chief Operating Officer sits across the table from me and he says, David, from where I'm sitting, this hasn't made a blind bit of difference to the performance of our company. I'm going to make a guess they were about 1% flow efficient. Right? It didn't make a blind bit of difference. He wasted his money. Right? Focusing on reducing the delays, the waiting, the queuing is where the big bang for the buck is. And no one's in charge of it in your organization. This is the core problem. Also, think about if you're in love with doing estimates. Someone asks you to estimate a piece of work. How much of this problem are you actually estimating? It's the 2%, 5% part of it. Because does anyone ever ask you to estimate how long it will spend waiting, queuing, blocked, delayed? Is there a story point mechanism for that? This is the real world, real reality, and we're focused on the wrong problem. We have been for a long time. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff on lead time distributions. You can read it later. Some other things I want to point out, just little things that people don't understand well. I hear a lot about buffers in Kanban. Typically, the key word in English is ready. If something is, in this case, engineering ready or deployment ready, that state is a buffer. It's usually buffering some form of non-instant availability or some sort of cyclical cadence. Move to this next slide. This guy here is not a buffer, right? This is another really badly reported thing, again, in the North American Agile community. Because we were doing development to something and we finished, and now it's in this little sub-column called done, what that's signaling is it's pullable into the next state. It is not a buffer. The name of that queue is development, right? There isn't a ongoing queue and a done queue. There is a single queue, and there are two states. Right? So the Kanban pull signal mechanism is being signaled with done. This is much more obvious if you look at some of the software Kanban tools, because they don't always use these two-column arrangements. Maybe they use a green outline on the ticket to say it's now pullable. Right? So it doesn't have its buffer because there is no buffer. Customer lead time I talked about. So imagine that we know when we want something. Sometimes we need it right now, but other times we know that we need something at some specific point in the calendar in the future, because it's some seasonal in nature. Maybe it's a website promotion for the 4th of July. And we don't need that right now, but we need it soon. So if we know when we need something, this helps to facilitate when should we start it, when should we pull it into the Kanban system, which helps facilitate the deferred commitment decision. Because if this is when we need it, because it will produce some benefit over time, and we happen to know the distribution of lead times for items going through our system, and we can plot that in the Kanban software like LeanKit. Chris Heffley's in the audience somewhere. Chris can show you this feature in his software. You can back out from that perhaps the 85th percentile, and that would tell you that the ideal starting point is here, at this point in the calendar. The x-axis here is time. I'm not sure why it's been edited off this slide, but a versioning problem in my PowerPoint. So if we start at that point, that's telling us we have a 6 in 7 chance of delivering it when we need it. And if we really, really need it, and we think it's one of the 1 in 7 that's not going to make it, then we can escalate it closer to the time. We can increase its class of service. We can give it a higher priority. This is the sort of stuff that facilitates deferred commitment. I'll skip over the metrics. I've shown you this is only a summary. So implementing a virtual Kanban system, do not copy an existing one. Do not copy something that you see in my slides or something you see in a book or something someone else presents. You have to design the Kanban system from first principles for your situation by analyzing the demand, analyzing your capabilities, and the size of the team, and so on, and actually designing the Kanban system to fit your situation. Right? It's slightly non-trivial. This is actually why some training is required, or reading some better quality material on Kanban helps a lot. And a reminder, the Kanban method is not a software development lifecycle process or a project management process. Right? The idea is that you Kanbanize your existing process. You need to be able to map that. And if you don't have an existing process, you have to pick one. Okay, so feedback loops. We now refer to these as the Kanban Kata. And we've identified 3 of them. The stand-up meeting, which I'll show you in a moment, then the improvement kata, the operations review. Those of you that are familiar with my book on this topic know that I have this cartoon on the cover. I commissioned this cartoon. And the idea of this cartoon is it's supposed to embody the entire essence of the Kanban method in a single picture. But what we have here is the team level feedback loop. We have a team standing in front of the board on a daily basis, and they're discussing what's going on in their life. Now, the first 3 characters who are saying, I'm stuck, I'm too busy, I'm idle, they could stand there every morning, they could shrug their shoulders, and they could say, back to work then, same old, same old. But actually, there's a 4th member of the team, and that member of the team is saying, you know what? This is happening a lot. Let's do something about it. And that act of leadership that you see there is what catalyzes the discussion that happens after the regular stand-up meeting. And those are referred to in the literature simply as after meetings. And that's where people discuss the issue they're seeing and talk about what they should do about it, and hopefully implement some changes, and their process evolves. So it gets a little different, hopefully better. And hopefully that discussion was facilitated by an understanding of the flow and the use of some models. The idea of thinking about bottlenecks or constraints or variability in the flow. The next thing is the improvement kata. This concept exists at Toyota because what we're really doing with the Kanban method is implementing the Toyota way for knowledge work. Now, I couldn't call it the Toyota way for knowledge work because actually Toyota doesn't do this kind of stuff in their IT department. They are still in the old waterfall land world, mostly. Anyway, a mentor-mentee relationship, usually but not always between a superior and a subordinate, where simply the superior, the middle manager perhaps, is looking at the line manager and saying, what's the current demand on your system? What's your current capability? What's the gap between those? And what are you doing about it? A bit like asking the manager at Starbucks, did anyone come in for a cup of coffee and you were unable to supply it before they got bored, left the store and went somewhere else? And if the answer was yes, that is happening in the rush hour, then perhaps they would get asked, well, what are you going to do about it? What action are you going to take to make sure if that customer comes back tomorrow, they'll actually be served fast enough that they won't get bored and go buy their cup of coffee somewhere else? That's what we're talking about here. Now, this was so obvious to me from 2006 and 2007, I didn't put it in the book. Because I didn't think I was writing a book about management. I thought I was writing a book about Kanban. And it took Håkan Fors to point out to me that this is an important feedback loop that I'd overlooked in the literature. This one is in the book, the operations review, the organization level feedback loop, the system of systems level feedback loop. Because if you've implemented Kanban at individual workflow levels, and many of the tickets in your Kanban system are blocked, and I know some very big companies, telephone equipment manufacturer comes to mind, in Europe particularly, and they have these huge big boards, hundreds of tickets on there, maybe 200 of them blocked. And then the following week, I'd go visit another part of their organization and they'd show me a different board. And I realized that the tickets on their board were the tickets that were blocked on the other board. And as I worked my way around Europe, I discovered there was a whole network of these. And what that company was lacking was this, the organizational level feedback loop. Because the stand-up meeting level feedback loop had got them to a certain level of performance, and then nothing was getting any better because they had Kanbanized locally and they didn't have the organization level feedback loop to make this work properly. So now that we've got all that, if I had to reiterate these 6 practices much more specifically, you'll see that it now says implement a virtual Kanban system. And instead of feedback loops, it says implement the Kanban Kata. It's getting a little bit more prescriptive. I want to link this together, scaling out across an organization. Because people will say to me, Kanban's a team process. That's another favorite of well-known Agile people here in North America. Kanban was never a team process. Even the first one we ever did in 2004 involved several different departments at Microsoft. Right? Kanban has always been a change method designed to be led from the middle. Grassroots Kanban's all very well. It will help you improve locally, but if you want the real big bang for the buck in your organization, it needs to be led from the middle, and it needs the operations review, the organization level feedback loop. The reason it works to be led from the middle is you do not need senior executive permission to start evolving. Nobody needs a budget to start an evolutionary process, right? There doesn't need to be a project. It doesn't need to be managed in the company's portfolio. Nobody needs a budget to start managing better, particularly if your job title's currently something manager, right? So, designed to be led from the middle, and maybe no accident that what I did for a living was middle manager in big American company. So imagine that we've got several Kanban systems in our organization, and they have their own independent demand and their own independent workflows and their capability to supply, but there is a certain amount of interdependency, that some work in one system requires work to be done in another system and returned back in order for the first work to be finished. So we start to get these interdependencies showing up. Now, if you read literature about Kanban in manufacturing, Taiichi Ohno said Kanban systems are self-leveling. That to me is very evident that he believed that human beings were part of the Kanban system. There had to be an observer and there had to be a feedback loop, because otherwise, how would it self-level? Who's adjusting the Kanban limits? Who's adjusting the resource allocations? So when you have this kind of interdependency, if you have the organization level feedback loop, things will start to change and adjust. The point of the operations review is to talk about how you change and adjust things and gradually move the culture of the organization so that that's an easier thing to do, that it's more possible. So the way that you scale Kanban is you scale it out in a service-oriented architecture fashion. Okay, you could talk about scaling down to personal Kanban and scaling up to portfolio Kanban. Still sort of an emerging area, that one. Not much documentation. But to scale this out, and we now see institutionalized examples of this. Petrobras in Brazil have an entire business unit that makes software for oil exploration. They have 10 interdependent Kanban systems across about 350 people. And they've had that now for several years. That's just one example. I keep hearing about more of these. So I know of examples of companies that have lots of Kanban systems, that have interdependent work. They don't have the feedback loop to improve further. And I know of some that do have the feedback loops and they do improve. The whole point here is that scaling out Kanban's pretty easy. You can do it one service at a time, and you always do it by first principles. And if you know anything about service-oriented architecture and software, you will understand that they're flat, right? So there's no assumption of scale-free for those that are aware of network science mathematics. One of the problems with, well, if it works at the team level, we'll move it up to the line manager level, and we'll move it up to the middle manager level, and so on. That's assuming that whatever the method you're using is scale-free. The problem with this in most organizations is that that group of managers at different levels, they don't behave like a team. So a method that works at the team level isn't going to work at the other levels because you don't have teams. Right? These organizations are not scale-free, even though the organization chart makes it look like they are. So avoiding a method that requires an assumption of scale-free gives you a much higher chance of actually scaling something. So Kanban is a service delivery, service-oriented approach, and you scale it one service at a time. That's really what this says. I've mentioned this a few times. The Kanban Kata are essential. Without the feedback loops, it doesn't work. I'm not sure why that slide was in there. It should have been hidden. So a summary of benefits, collaboration benefits, shared language for improved collaboration. Right, Kanban really facilitates that. I didn't really get into it too much in this presentation. Shared understanding of the dynamics of flow. Make the invisible work visible, let people see it. Empathy will improve in the organization. Engage people emotionally. Because it's visual and often tactile, people are engaged in a whole different way than they would be if it was on a spreadsheet. And greater empowerment without loss of control comes from making the process policies explicit and understanding the rules and the dynamics of the Kanban system. It increases the level of trust at higher levels in the organization. And if there's greater trust, there can be greater empowerment, which means lower level individual contributors have much more decision-making authority. Tangible business benefits. I haven't shown you a lot of examples, but improved predictability of lead time and delivery rates, reduced rework, improved risk management, improved agility, and improved governance. The organizational benefits, improved trust and organizational social capital. In other words, you don't need an assumption of a high trust environment. The level of trust gets better gradually over time. The emergence of system thinking. I don't expect everyone in an organization to become a system thinker, but if your job title is something manager, you are operating a system, and if you're not a system thinker, you shouldn't be something manager. Right? You should be deleting that word manager from your title and getting a different job. Management focused on system capability and policy definition. In other words, how many cups of coffee did you make today? Right? If you can't answer that question for your environment, you're actually not managing what you do for a living. And organizational adaptability, this core concept that we've designed the organization to evolve. We're not just adapting to changing requirements for software projects, we're adapting the whole organization because now the processes can evolve. So as the business environment and the business risks we're managing changes, that organization feedback loop will facilitate us making incremental evolutionary changes. The change management benefits, I mentioned this briefly, significantly reduced resistance to change because the changes are small. You start with what you do now. And the team get to talk about their own changes. The organization talks about its own changes. They're not imposed from some outside group. They're not imposed from a textbook, and they're not imposed from some grand designer who thinks he knows better. Right? They evolve from the team's own experience. Processes are uniquely tailored to the business environment, and evolutionary changes, particularly when they're small, they greatly reduce the risk of failure during any one change. So rather than take on one great big transition that has a budget and it was approved in the portfolio and now there's political risk attached to it, make lots of little changes evolutionarily and make it as part of the day-to-day management job in the organization. And then fundamentally it's change led from the middle, and often change led without permission and without the need for a budget. Because if your job title is something manager, you have permission to manage. That's what you're expected to be doing, and no one will complain if you start doing it better. I'm glad somebody laughed. Right, Kanban improves agility. The lead times gradually get better. They reduce. Predictability of delivery gradually improves because we've limited the work in progress and we're focused on the not working. Organizational social capital improves. So all of these things fit with that definition of Agile from the beginning. What does it really mean to be thinking in an Agile way? Governance, risk management are improved. Empowerment without loss of control because of the visibility, the explicit policies. And improvements are often dramatic. One of the great case studies in the Kanban literature is at the BBC, where they scaled Kanban to 20, 30 different departments. The first one of those, there's an academic study published in IEEE Management by Peter Middleton and David Joyce, shows a 700% delivery rate improvement. And that one department, they made revenue from ad impressions on the website. The lead time reduction enabled an extra $1 million per year in additional ad revenue from the web pages that one department produced. Right? Real tangible business benefits and reported in a trustworthy, peer-reviewed management journal. So, if you're interested in this and you want to learn more from a good quality source that actually understands the stuff I've presented, there's a business that we created called Lean Kanban University that accredits trainers and accredits a curriculum for training, and also now offers a designation for coaches, which is also a peer-reviewed activity, the Kanban Coaching Professional. Anyone with either of these designations, AKT or KCP, can give you good quality Kanban advice. There are maybe one or two handfuls of people in the world who don't have these accreditations who can give you good Kanban advice. Right. Other than that, there's a lot of really poor quality guidance out there. And then in addition to that, we have the Lean Kanban Conference Series. Globally, it's a franchise arrangement. My own company runs the North American one and the UK one. Next year's North American one is in San Francisco in May. And with that, there's maybe just a few minutes left for some questions. Thank you. I'm not sure how this question thing works, but there's a microphone here somewhere.
Probably have room or time for maybe one or two questions.
Hi, yes. Do you see any advantage over an electronic board or an actual physical virtual board?
So the question is there an advantage between physical and virtual boards? It's very circumstantial. That there are definitely circumstances where you couldn't do it properly without the software, without the virtual boards. There is some value still in having the tactile nature of the physical boards that really engages people emotionally. But the advantage on the electronic stuff is it generates all the metrics for you. So the electronic boards facilitate the operations review level very well. The physical boards facilitate the stand-up meeting level, Kata, better, perhaps. So actually, I think you should do both.
Oh, both? Really? But you don't want people to go, oh my God, I'm mired in process, right? You want to probably pick one that fits your situation in the context of the environment with the folks that you have and what approach that is to what they feel most comfortable with.
It might have been better if you still had the microphone. To summarize,
Okay, so the question was, really, do you want to do both, or do you want to get mired in process with having,
without doubt, people do complain if they have to keep the two systems in sync. And if that were the case, and say people are working happily enough with the software, then I'd probably go with that. If you're only going to do physical boards locally, then you have to gather metrics manually if you're going to have an operations review, even if people are all located in the same building. But there does seem to be a certain amount of magic about physical boards. There are some systems emerging that sort of marry the two ideas together, where they print out, what are they called, QR codes on the notes, and then they use digital cameras to automatically generate the metrics. So you use a physical board, but it generates an electronic board and people can see it remotely. Those systems are still in their infancy. There's a company, their entire company runs with Kanban. They're called Jimdo in Hamburg in Germany. It's a startup, but they're now about 200 people perhaps. And the software they created for the QR code hybrid, they have made that open source, and you'll find it on their website, something like jimflow.jimdo.com.
Well, we are out of time today. It's a little bit past 4:30, and we are wrapping up from the conference perspective. I want to give a big hand to David Anderson. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.